Yeah. Yeah, mine's on too.
That broke down 3 times for me during my
Yeah.
check that that's coming through at the back.
I'm not sure if the slides are sorted on this end first.
So I know that was an issue the last time. We just had the slides weren't moving on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually, it's just whether it's the right ones on there now, that's all.
Welcome everyone to the next in our Abstract 45 series, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Dan Gilmour tonight. So Dan's obviously going to take you on a journey through his research, but just in terms of introduction, some of you may know some of these facts, so apologies if I'm repeating these things. Others of you may not know these, but Dan's had a very long association with the university. After doing his undergrad up at Dundee Uni, he came down the road to Abertay to do his masters with us, and that was way back in 1997, graduating with his masters in 1998, and that was in water and environmental management at that point in time. Dan then obviously went off to work in industry for a little bit, but then came back to us, and he's been with us for almost 25 years, so quite a long track record with us in this space. In that time, he's obviously had a journey through lecturing, has got his PhD, is also Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy as well, and he's done, alongside obviously his research projects, which he's going to talk you through this evening, he's also led on quite a strategic partnership for us with an institution in France, ESCT, and the work that he's done there really has been quite exemplary as well. He led that partnership for almost a decade, and certainly the work that was done there was used as case studies in our most recent sort of ELR, in terms of, again, how to set up partnerships and to get them to work and how they evolve across time. So a great piece of work that Dan has done in that space as well. But in relation to his research, again, it's been quite eclectic in some ways. I don't think, you're not necessarily a social geographer, are you? I don't think that's how you would describe yourself necessarily, but you've wandered into different areas in there, and it's definitely looked at ageing and inclusion in some of those projects, has looked at ones which, again, very much are around about sustainability, net zero. Most recently, you've been doing quite a lot of work in that space, but also has had projects funded by the Scottish Government to go out to Malawi and look at, again, the impact of building dams, and that involved very much the community in terms of, obviously, doing a big project like that. It does affect people's day-to-day lives, and brought in sociologists on that project too. So again, he's done a great job of bringing money in, keeping going with his research profile, but also, very importantly, mentoring colleagues along the way and bringing colleagues on board and supporting them to get on their research journey as well. So I'm going to stop at this point and hand over to Dan to take us through that journey. So over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Andrea, and thanks for that introduction. It was quite comprehensive, so I'm quite impressed. I certainly has helped me. Can I just apologise before I start that I have got a bit of a tickle, so if I'm then I'm just trying to keep on top of it, and I have got a drink, so I might have to take that as we go. So today's talk is really going to sort of have a look at, as the introduction, let's see if we're going, yeah, is thinking about delivering services, but thinking about how can we be innovative in delivering services, how can we engage people, and fundamentally how can we make sure that these are sustainable. So what I'm going to do is just take you through a little bit about some of the concepts, and then I'm going to take you through thinking about sustainability, thinking about decision support, thinking how we can make sure these are included in service provision, and also thinking with some examples of how we can support government and stakeholders in applying some of these. So, as Andrea says, my journey started thinking about water environmental management, but obviously then growing into different areas. And sustainability in itself, like we have these challenge spaces at university, and making sure we work across disciplines, and I've had the benefit over time of working with lots of different people during these projects. So when I talk about some of the concepts and some of the projects we've done later on, there's a lot of people, a few in the room, who we've worked on as we go. So what I'd like to start with is really looking at sustainable development and sustainability, and I had the benefit of watching Stefano's presentation last month, and he was really good at starting from the starting points and bringing some of the concepts, and I thought, well, maybe I can try a little bit of that in terms of sustainable development. And I maybe started with a slide that's not readable, which is probably a no-no in terms of setting off, but this is really just to see that it's an emergence of sustainable development concepts have come over time. It didn't just happen in 1987 or 1992, as we're going to start talking about later, but it grew from the awareness of industrialisation in the sort of 40s and 1940s, 1950s, things like the London smog, where the awareness of industrialisation and the impact of using resources. So it started on a very environmental awareness footing, but has grown much more into a wider understanding as we go. One of the publications I wanted to draw attention to was a Silent Spring publication by Rachel Carlson in 1962, which is this one here. And this was a seminal piece of work which talked about the use of pesticides and these kind of things like DDT, and raised this environmental awareness that we can't be encouraging a lot of these uses. And actually, it was very critical of industry and governments wanting to keep using this for their own benefit without looking at some of the impacts. So it started this awareness, and other ones like the Tragedy of the Commons, which again is another very famous piece of work, which was talking about how private sector specifically were using a lot of resources that were in that public domain. So how could these be more addressed, how they could be managed, and this started to build up this awareness and a bit of suspicion or a bit of animosity about how people are using some of these resources. So again, 1970s, we have the Stockholm Declarations and these types of things. But one thing that I think is particularly interesting is the impact of environmental impact assessments in this awareness. In the 1970s in North America and US, that became law to have an environmental impact assessment, and that's for all developments that had to be done. And part of that was to start thinking about what the development was and what this environmental impact might be. So it wasn't just about the economy, it was starting to think about the environment as well. So even now, that's a really key part for our work in terms of environmental impact assessment, because it gives you that environmental, economic and social aspects that we're thinking about. So that was really just to get a starting point before we come to perhaps some of the more familiar types of things that, and this is especially for Colin for his defining sustainability type of thing. So I think we'll all be quite familiar with this sustainable development definition from the World Commission on Environment and Development, which did a report called Our Common Future, and Brundtland was the chair of this, the Norwegian former Prime Minister, and this has become one of the main go-to definitions as such. So it's talking about sustainable development that's meeting the needs of the present without compromising future generations to meet their own needs. So on the surface, that's quite simple, but if we're thinking about what our needs are and where are we starting from. So first off, if we're thinking about intergenerational needs, so that's between generations, we have to start thinking about what our needs are at the moment, and you'd probably argue that everybody's needs are quite different, Even within Dundee, everybody's needs are different, let alone if we're thinking globally. Thinking about something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we have basic human needs like shelter, food, warmth, protection, up to the top of the triangle, which has got self-actualization, which is about allowing us to become the best we can be. And in the middle, we've got things like learning and respect. So what are the needs of today? That's the first question that makes it more difficult than just saying, well, meet the needs of today. And then, that's within our own generations, let alone how can we predict what other generations might need. So there's some challenges here that we have to start thinking about when we're thinking about some of the concepts of sustainable development. And the other thing you might have heard is people talking about sustainability. Some people talking about sustainable development, and quite often these are used interchangeably. Yeah, I'll probably do it during this talk. And they probably mean two different things. Sustainability, you could argue, is getting that balance of environmental, social, economic, using resources, this type of thing. Whereas the sustainable development is the process of getting to that point. Development that's enhancing our well-being, enhancing our development as such, and health and well-being. So what are all these different concepts? So what I'm going to try and do is take us through a few of those. But before I do that, I thought, actually, we heard about the Brundtland Commission report, which talked about what this definition is. But something that quite often people don't really talk about is actually they gave us in 1987 a pathway to achieving some of these. And what I want to talk about tonight is about decision making and sustainability and bringing them together. And that's the first thing that they identified in whatever 40 odd years before to say this is what we need to be doing. So they've got a number of different systematic issues that they would like to have us address. Firstly, that we're active citizen participation in decision making and in making choices. So political awareness, an economic system that gives us that technical knowledge, but also that reliant on thinking about how can we be innovative for sustainability, and social systems where we're thinking about this disharmonious development and how can we have that avoiding NIMBYism or always poorer people living next to the environmental degradation. So how can we get these balances? And other things like environmental protection, and also thinking about how we can use technology and working together. And when we start talking about some of the concepts later, you'll see that these come up again and how these have been built on. So again, if we started talking about definitions, then we have to conceptualize them in some way, and you can see that the academics of the 90s really enjoyed this, so this must be where I got it from, that, you know, how can we draw the diagrams that show this sustainable development definition of concept. So we've got maybe like the high school geography type of Venn diagram where you have the economy, the environment, and social equity, social justice. And in the middle, if you have the right balance, you have sustainable development. So that's quite a traditional way of showing how if you get the balance right, that's in the middle. Then a little bit later, you have a concentric circle, Russian doll style, that you have one inside the other. So you have to have environment before you have society, before you can have the economy. So that's understanding there's more of a relationship, that you have to have all three perhaps. And then we started thinking again about participation. How do people get involved? So it's bringing in, as well as having the environmental, social and economic, you've got that institutional democracy, justice type of thing. So this shaped kind of engagement. So you're trying to think about how people participate as well. So you can see how these concepts are developing, and the diagrams again developed, and obviously as academics we want to come up with something new, so you want to always try to investigate. So more diagrams. People start thinking, well, how else can we think about these concepts? And one of the main changes in thinking was thinking about capitals. So instead of thinking about just the components, we're thinking, what are these? These could be capitals. And this is from Jonathan Poirot's work from Forum of the Future, and this 5 capital model where you have the natural capital, you then have the social and human capital, and you have this financial manufactured capital, which again you could reflect in that social, environmental, economic categories. So part of this is to really think, well, how do these capitals interact, and do we need all of them, and how do they feed off? So this capital model shows you're using some to consume to make others, and how can you do that in a sustainable way. And he presents a sort of 12-stage system of how you can have a vision where you're using each of these sustainably so you're not diminishing any of these. So that was quite interesting. And the DEFRA diagram just on that side, which is talking about well-being, so another concept that starts coming in is saying, actually, what are we trying to develop for? It's for people's well-being, and how there's a consumption of each of these capitals for us to get this well-being. So you've got produced capital, so you've got human capital, social capital, natural capital at that far end, and then we've got a consumption, going for a walk in the park, that's us consuming natural capital, you know, we're enjoying it, therefore we've started thinking about a well-being. Same as social goods and services, friendships or relationships. So all these come in this consumption, and we then can feed our well-being. It doesn't mean that we're using this resource in a negative way, but we're engaging. So it's this interaction around well-being and how we can link to some of these capitals. So we're starting to think about what are these. So then we started to think, well, what kind of sustainable development or sustainability do we have? And there's another concept that I just wanted to pick up briefly about what kind of vision do we have. And we've got our Venn diagram, which can actually be described as weak sustainability, because it's suggesting that we have to, you know, take one from another. So we're having to substitute or can substitute these things. And in two concepts, the Mickey Mouse is quite a nice way of talking about it, that you've shown that, you know, if you make a focus on one part and make a difference from the others, you can really have an unbalanced approach to this development. So this is a way that you could argue this could be considered weak sustainable development or sustainability. Whereas strong, a bit like our concentric circles, is where we're trying to retain each of these and we're making sure that they have to be complementary. So the strong sustainability is about this non-diminishing opportunities, which again, if we think back to our needs of the present and needs of the next generation, we're trying to make sure that the sustain opportunities later on. So this non-diminishing opportunities is quite a good way, excuse me. So we're wanting to make sure that we're consuming these stocks of capital, but making sure that they're still existing for the next generation. So these are some of the kind of concepts I wanted to just start off with, to say, okay, there's a lot out there based on this first definition, and how do we take these things forward? So I'd probably argue that we could spend all day deciding what our definition is, and we could probably, in this room, spend a long time deciding what the definition might be. So I think there's a step where you say, okay, there's a general concept that you have these three parts: environment, social, and then economic. And we have to think about then, how do we see what direction we're going, how do we measure these things? So the general agreement that we need more sustainable development. And so how do we get there, regardless of what our particular definition is? And what you found were that different sectors would have a different definition. So if you're looking at the agriculture sector, they'll be focusing on one part. If you're looking at the built environment, they're focusing in a different way. A considerate construction scheme might talk about sustainability in some way. So you can have different definitions, but as long as the same direction is looking for. And what we've seen is sustainability or sustainable development has been used in a lot of policy documents and at all sorts of different levels. EU, globally, World Bank, these type of things, but also nationally, we're expecting them in policy documents. And one key thing is, if we need to say we want to get to a certain direction, we have to manage it. So how do we manage it? Well, we'll have to understand where we are. So you can argue if you can't measure something, you can't manage it. So we can't measure it, therefore we need to monitor to see how we can get the sustainability performance, understand, and then get this direction. So there's a need for measurement, so therefore you need to have some kind of development of indicators, and that's what I'm going to take us on to in terms of our sustainability assessment in just a moment. The reason why we might need to measure these policy interactions and this type of thing, this is a Sankey diagram from the EU Green Deal, and I just picked this off to sort of show the complexity of a number of different policies. You've got your goals, but how do you actually pick up what the impact of your actions might be? So part of this measurement is to make sure that your policies have been successful, you've identified what actions have actually worked, and for the policy makers, you've got a justification to keep supporting a certain action, or alternatively, changing direction and doing something else. I remember I see Ruth in the audience, we did some Sankey diagrams for this water, energy, food project, and it shows the very complex interactions of all these different things. So I was just wanted to show that as an example. So how might we put some of these things into action? And I would probably argue that my work's on the more operationalising sustainability kind of concepts and some of the theory, but we're thinking about how we might bring these together. And one route that's been very successful in terms of putting these concepts into practice is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which was a UN initiative where I think only 2 countries so about 196 countries signed up for the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a commitment to try and address some of the sustainable issues within sustainable development. So the idea is that it gives us a roadmap for looking at these 17 different goals and saying if we contribute to all of them, we'll be able to address some of the major issues in terms of things like poverty, environmental degradation, energy, water, environment, and how they all interact. So one of the key things is that they're related to each other. So these are the goals, and they have a number of different targets that they are based under. And the key point is that all countries signed up to meeting these goals, and each country has then their own individual plan to put against. And one of the most useful things is that the plans aren't set for these countries. They fit what they want to achieve within these different activities. So it's very much a case of it gives a roadmap for what we want to do. It did take a long time to reach these kind of agreements, as you can imagine, and I think over 2 years they were negotiated at the terms we can do. And I'm going to pick up some of these a bit later on. If we're thinking about our concentric circles and thinking about these goals, we could have a look at them like this, and this diagram is from the Stockholm Research Centre, but the idea is these are all interrelated. But you can see how they could be considered in the same way as we looked at these concentric circles that we had earlier on in our concepts. And the key thing is 3 parts. The first one is about that they're universal, which means that we can all contribute to them. And I know in our research, for example, on Pure, our research is tagged against these Sustainable Development Goals, so the university is showing how we're contributing to them. In terms of university reporting, to the government frameworks, there's a strategy framework that reports all these goals up. So we're all contributing in our own ways, so all sectors, all businesses, all organisations can contribute, so it's not just certain groups. The second point is that they're all interrelated, so even though we've actually shown them like this, they're all related, so you can't just try and achieve one goal, you have to try and achieve a number of them, and that helps us think about that sustainable development way that they're all related and you're not just trying to seek 1 or 2 agendas. Excuse me. And the last part, which is maybe where we're struggling a little bit, that to achieve these, and they were set in 2015, and it was the agenda for 2030, so we're just after halfway through this time period, that they're expecting us to have transformational change to actually achieve them. So we have to do something different to be able to achieve these different goals. And I'm going to pick up one of the goals as one of my project examples, and within that goal they have certain things that are set up. So again, a bit of a diagram that's difficult to see, but the idea is just to get the general perspective that I've talked about sustainable development, I've talked about the goals, and now I just want to talk about infrastructure and service provision. And just wanted to show how, if we've got 17 goals, service or infrastructure provision relates to all of these goals. So all of the goals are affected by us providing services to people. And 70% of these goals are affected by infrastructure specifically. So we can see that actually the colours are the goals and how they've been directly or indirectly related. So it's very much about understanding these relationships and putting in this infrastructure. You're looking across the benefits. They're all linked together, okay? So it's very much about making sure the infrastructure is effective in one sector, so we've got energy, water, transport, but actually the link across, because if you're providing these services, you're allowing people to go to work, you're having clean water to drink, energy to use, these kind of things. So you're actually affecting a lot of these. And we've been starting to look about resilient infrastructure was another phrase, but I won't go into that just now, but how do you put in this infrastructure that's actually going to stand the changes in the future? So there's lots of action going on there. So if I work my way to sustainable services, so that's where we're actually getting to in terms of the kinds of projects that we've been working on at the moment. We're thinking about what kind of services we need to use and how do we deliver these in a way that is environmentally responsible. So that's thinking about resource use and and minimising waste and this type of thing. That they're economically viable, so they're doable projects. They actually have the finance to do them, and often it's about being innovative to be able to make them viable. But we're thinking about social equity, thinking about being affordable for everybody, and also thinking about fairness and justice as part of this. So when we're thinking about these kind of services, I've chosen this water, energy, food part, but Andrea in her introduction talked about the healthcare projects. You could equally put up and talked about how you could be talking about equity, responsibility, viability. And the policy and governance at the end, that's about engaging people within this network. So we've got lots of different parts to this sustainability picture, and what I want to do now is just think about how do we engage in the next part of the picture, which is thinking about decision support and how we can do these things. So, talked about sustainability, the concepts, and how do we then bring that together with helping stakeholders think about these service provision, how we can actually get these concepts put into the decision-making process. And next after that, I'll talk about how we've done in some of these projects. So, in terms of decision-making, well, I'll just go through these briefly, but we have a rational decision-making model, which we would imagine we would do if maybe we were buying a new car or a washing machine or something, where we say, actually, well, maybe a new car, we'd say, well, what do we want? What is our criteria? What's our budget? What options do we have? And then what are there? What's out there? That type of thing. And then we would evaluate it in some way. So you can imagine you might have a rational decision-making process if you were investing something very significant and you were spending a long time identifying. But even if we were doing that, we could never get all the information. We wouldn't have the capacity to evaluate all these different options. So the rational decision-making model is a good way of structuring the decision, but actually what happens is within our decision-making process, it's most likely that we'll use the second one, which is bounded rationality, which is the idea of that we come up with a solution that is good enough, it meets our needs. So if I want to buy a new washing machine, I might go, okay, there's 1,000 washing machines out there. Is it white? Yes. Okay, that's decided the first part. Is it my budget? Okay. Is it the right brand? Okay, that satisfied my needs, I'll buy that one. So you're not optimizing the choices, you're finding the solution that fits these criteria. So this is a much more likely approach that decision makers use, and we have to be aware that we're looking at this in terms of satisficing is important. So has it met the criteria, has it met the needs that we have? So this Simon's bounded rationality model, as you see it, the work was done very early on in terms of in the 50s, and it's carrying on in models today where we're thinking how do we make sure that we're satisfying our needs, and when we're thinking about decision support, how do we know what these needs are? So we talked about early on about including people in decisions, and inclusive decision making is a key part to this. But we have to identify some challenges around that. The decision making is complex, that we have this process that we need to go through to try and think about these things. So it's complex. Often decisions affect lots of people, so you have lots of different groups being affected by this. And if you're the decision maker, you have to think about what you're trying to do in terms of making a decision, but you have to represent other people's needs or other people's opinions within this decision. How do we make sure that we do this? And if we're being inclusive and encouraging people to follow this kind of path, we have to make sure that stakeholders know how a decision's got to, how they've achieved, followed that decision, and also that they felt that even if they don't agree or it hasn't come to their viewpoint, that they were part of this decision. So it has to show that sort of transparency of understanding. So if we're trying to think about sustainability, we're trying to bring people within this decision-making process, we have to show how we might have arrived at these kind of decisions. So to do that, we have to try and understand the decision maker's needs, and what the decision maker needs is the right information at the right time and to the right person, which sounds quite simple, but as we know, trying to get the right information so you can actually make a decision is sometimes quite challenging. You find out after you've done something that wasn't the right thing to do, and who's got this information. So this is key to understanding, and how we can support people is understanding what the decision maker might need. So again, some diagrams you can't see, but the idea is that we have a decision process and we have what information the decision makers used and what and where they've used it. So what we're trying to do is understand how decisions are made so that we can actually then identify where we can improve these decisions, where we can enhance these decisions, and where we can bring in sustainable development concepts within this. So the example on the far side here is work I did quite a few years ago with Dundee City Council, where we're saying, okay, where it was looking at the waterfront development, but where can we enhance sustainability, at what stages of the process, and on what information do they use. So it's actually understanding these things. And the final concept I just wanted to pick up is really just about engagement of people and stakeholders. And this is a really nice model that captures a lot of this process from the Design Council in terms of how firstly can we engage what people need. So this co-design kind of idea of understanding these needs. And we've got this double diamond in the middle where we don't just assume that we know what people need in terms of, but we actually find out by doing something with them. And Ken's in the audience today. Ken and I have done a lot of co-design where we're actually saying what actually do we need from these people, how can we then define it, and then how can we come up with ideas that are helpful to addressing some of these problems. Now I was thinking about talking about sustainable development and sustainable service provision, and part of that is saying you're going to come out with something at the end. Your outcome is a new service or something you're doing, and there are lots of mini decisions within that, and we have to think, how do we engage and support people? So this kind of model from the Design Council allows us to think about this with that double diamond, and also talk about it being people-centred. So we're thinking about how do we engage people in the process, how do we understand what they need, and then from that we can get a much more balanced and engaged decision. Okay. So just to summarise what we need to do, if we're trying to get a better decision, think about sustainability, we have to first understand what these concepts are in terms of social, environmental, economic aspects. We have to try and measure them in some way. We have to identify this decision-making process and try and help get some of these ideas within the decision maker's needs. So we have to understand what are the processes and where we can influence it. And finally, we have to make sure during this process that we engage with a wide range of stakeholders. Okay. So how do we do these kind of things? Well, we ended up with a framework which captured a lot of these kind of initiatives or information. And this was a SAVE framework, which is about combining the sustainability, the assessment in terms of measurement, visualization about communicating this information, and there's no point in measuring things without enhancing them, so actually to say, how do we make these things better? So we tried to combine the concepts that I've just talked about into this SAFE framework. So shall we look? So what I wanted to do was just briefly take you through a couple of examples of how we've used this and taken forward some of these concepts. And these actually were the basis of impact case study for the last REF, where we looked at supporting Scottish Government in terms of water and how they could develop their more sustainable communities. So the first project I'll briefly take you through is really just thinking about small communities, and we talked about SDGs in Scotland with the challenge for SDG 6, which is about safe access for water everywhere. Small rural communities in Scotland still have a lot of private water supplies, and the standards can actually be quite difficult to meet for the drinking water quality regulator. So this project, we were asked to look at what were the options in terms of innovative solutions, and actually how could the Scottish Water improve their processes of identifying them. And the little quote in brackets is really just from the impact case study, where they were saying actually to help create a more affordable and resilient service, we went through these kind of activities. And this is pictures from, not from my holidays, but I have been to Gia camping, and a big range from loads of tourists to a very small. So how do we actually get these things? So what do we have to do in this project? And almost you can see that this 1 to 5 follows this same SAFE framework as such. So firstly, we're thinking about the innovations and what innovations are available out there. We were then trying to identify what viable technologies could there be, and then what kind of criteria could we measure these against. And finally, how do we bring these together using multi-criteria decision making? So that's actually decision support, which is a bit like that rational decision making model. And the idea is that we're helping the decision maker go through each of these steps to make sure that they have a good view of some of these things. In terms of technologies, well, when you start a project, you think, okay, we'll come up with a whole set of technologies and we'll be able to do it for all kind of catchments. But actually, very quickly, we know that a decision is going to be based on the location, so it's very scenario dependent, but also catchment specific, because everywhere the community is different, their needs are different, these kind of things. So no size fits all. So that was one of the things that we needed to identify for Scottish Water's, how they go about identifying options, but how do they then make sure it's the right one. So what we did in this project was we identified different stakeholders, got together in workshops to identify firstly what the viable technologies might be, and then taking them through the process of engaging with the different criteria to identify what would be their weightings and how they would evaluate these technologies and help support Scottish Water identify what the most important ones were. So that was the first output of the project, actually a process that they can follow in other places. And then the other kind of output was a typical set of sustainability criteria, where we're looking across economic, social, technical performance, because it was a treatment works, and also environmental issues, and what would we have to consider and how you would compare different options. So this went through the process, and we did these different workshops to identify what these issues were. And the result of these projects, where we were able to improve the decision-making process for Scottish Water within that context, we were able to help the communities be included within the decision-making process, which in itself you could argue makes it more sustainable because they're engaged. We're also trying to identify from the criteria what were the best in terms of performance of these options. And we were able to inform the Scottish Water in terms of selecting appropriate treatment for rural communities. And what it meant was that Scottish Water then had a new process that they could use for different stages, and they went through a number of different technologies and tested them against this process. So in itself it was a good project, and it certainly was impactful in terms of helping Scottish Water improve rural communities. And the second case study I just want to briefly flick through is really about the same process again, but looking at SDGs in Malawi, where we were trying to identify for the Scottish Government where best to support the Scottish, the SDG 6 achievement, and the Scottish Government were very keen to support Malawi in this, and how could they do this. So we went through, again, a bit like a technology change, but this one around what are the technical barriers or the barriers for water supply, what are the stakeholders, and then also how can the Scottish Government support the provision of these things. So in terms of demand, you can imagine there's quite a few challenges in terms of climate change, increasing demand on water. But one of the things we found, actually, large-scale deforestation was a big issue, because in terms of, I think 89% of Malawi households use charcoal for cooking. They don't have access to electricity. So it's a big demand, and with the population changing from, I think, doubled from 2010 to 2020, there's again this huge demand on wood, and that links to recharge and aquifers and this type of thing. And going along with the lowering demand, how could services be delivered in a better way? So the first picture was a changing demand of water, and then we were tasked with trying to understand the situation in Malawi in terms of what are the water stakeholders. Now, this looks quite a complicated diagram. You could have seen the first version of it, which was we did 30 interviews and we asked people who they spoke to, and it was a very complicated. So this is more simplified, but the idea is we tried to group based on the different roles that people had within this. But just to give you an idea, I think there was something like 300 NGOs working in the sector, and the challenge was that there's no oversight, so people can come in, drill some boreholes, go away again, meet their own whatever KPIs that they had, but there was no oversight of these things. So we did some work to monitor both of these and see how we can understand how the water sector in operation. So here again, the idea here is just that the coordination is very difficult across the piece. So what we did was we used this to identify how we could enhance the sector and how we could suggest ideas for offering support from Scottish Government. And we also came up with a set of enhancement indicators which link to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think we did something like 30 interviews, we did theme analysis to identify what these issues were. We then identified what indicators they might relate to them, and then that helps monitor progress into the future. Okay. So the last part was to develop this critical path. So this is where we were suggesting what action Scottish Government could take to support the Malawi Government. And the first one was really about coordination of groups and helping in terms of a donor to the country where they could do the best effect. So about coordination efforts within these NGOs. The second part was thinking about governance and where Scottish Government could help with that. And one of the key aspects was organisations like Scottish Water International, who could go out and offer asset management advice, so they could support training and also help with management plans. And again, SEPA, with their regulatory experience, could help where regulatory control was. So we went through this process, the SAVE process again in this project, and we were able to identify this critical path. And what it meant was we were able to engage with stakeholders, identify sustainable indicators, and talk and help identify how interventions in the future could be enhanced. We provided Scottish Government with the tools to use in other areas and interventions for the SDG, and developed a critical path which they then implemented in terms of putting interventions in with SEPA, the Scottish Water International, to support the Malawi Government in reaching the SDG 6. So that was my last slide, apart from just a conclusion slide, which is really just about the summary of the challenges. So really just to say the challenges around engaging people, identifying how we measure and how we enhance the process. So really the three elements, and that the approaches that we've used have been effective in doing these things. Okay, so thanks very much, everybody. I'll stop there.
So there is time for questions both in the room and online, so it's over to colleagues to ask questions.